Good morning, church. Good to see all of you this morning. We're going to continue our series. We're talking about the big questions. And I don't know about you, but at some point it dawns on you when you're having an argument with somebody, sometimes you're not even asking the right questions. If you're in an organization or business and you're trying to address a problem, every once in a while it dawns on you, you're not even addressing the systemic core issue. You're not asking the right questions. We're always looking for answers. That's what we do. We turn to the Bible and Scripture, and we turn to Jesus in particular for answers. What I think is surprising to a lot of us is to find a lot of questions that Jesus is help us frame. I mean, if we don't ask the right questions, we'll never get to the right answers, and Jesus wants us to get to the right answers. And so time and time again, he asks questions of us to help us reframe and reset what we're really trying to understand or to address. So we're talking about the big questions, and we began the series with a series of why questions, and now we're just talking about Jesus asking questions. Do you really want to get well? Why are you so afraid? Over and over again, he's asking questions of us, and I want to sort of put us into the gospel so that we don't just read it as a casual observer, but those questions are really posed to us. Do we want to really get well? Why are we so afraid? Question after question that we're looking at in this series. And today, as Carly had read, this story that may be very familiar to you, we're going to look for a deeper truth. Let's bow our heads. God, let the words of my mouth, meditations of our hearts, be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So why are you so afraid is the question, and the answer is all of us are afraid of something. There's not a single person who does not have some deep-seated fear. In fact, it could be public speaking, it could be the fear of water, heights, whatever it is, you've got it, you know it. You know what keeps you up, fear of snakes, rodents, whatever it might be. I could go down the list and you would say, yeah, that's mine, that's my phobia. You know, there's over 550 identified phobias, and I'm sure there's more than that, but 550 off of a list, and they really encompass everything, and some of them are normal that you would think are natural phobias, fears, and then some are a little bit strange, so I'm going to have to read this, okay? So some are strange. How about Neophobia? That's the fear of anything new. Novercaphobia is the fear of your stepmother. That's a very specific one, isn't it? Optophobia is the fear of opening one's eyes. And then here's my favorite three in particular. You got to really listen to this one. Be patient. Potamonstrosis, quipid, aliophobia. That's the fear of long words. And I'm thinking, you've got to be kidding me. That's a half a page of one word, and that's the fear of it. So I guess if you're able to pronounce that, you get over your fear of long words. How about Homilophobia? Aaron, are you listening? Mark, everybody else? It's the fear of sermons. You can insert your joke into that as well. How about the last one, Phobophobia, which is the fear of what? Being afraid. We're all afraid of something, and it's in that list at some point, but there's something that drives us, and the fear that compels us isn't always a good thing. A little bit of fear helps keep us alert and heightened sense of awareness. Too much fear paralyzes us. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember the Y2 scare. If you lived through that, it was real. I mean, it was 1999, and they were understanding that somehow there might be a glitch in the computer system because it couldn't read 2000. And once it was January 1st, 2000, and when the clock ticked, that somehow it would be this incredible disaster. Computers would shut down. The grid would shut down. You would have bank failures. Everything happened, and you had this incredible sense of panic and fear, and the clock ticking closer and closer to the year 2000. If you lived through it, you knew how real it was. I was serving a church, and I remember a number of people who came to me, and they said, we've got to start hoarding things. We've got to start making sure we have supplies. We've got to collect all the food and make sure that we can have it if something disastrous happens. And I'm thinking to myself, this doesn't feel right. I mean, we're a church that tells us not to be afraid, and we are panicked. Are we not any different from anybody else in this world? And those of you who lived through that and knew how incredible it is, that sort of ticked closer and closer, and finally the clocks ticked, 2000 came, what happened? Absolutely nothing. And yeah, there was a lot of preparation for that, but it was always a wasted sense of fear, an irrational reaction to something that was never going to happen. So we all have something to fear. Fear does something to us, I think sometimes not in a good way. And we're all afraid of something because Jesus knows that we are, because Jesus knows who we are. So Mark is going to tell this story, and I think we need to hear it. And whether you've heard this 100 times before, I think it's important to dust it off again, to look for something new in the context of where you are right now, your life as it's laid out. Because you read this story when you're younger, and it's a good story, interesting, but then you read it in the midst of a crisis, and it speaks to you on a level you weren't prepared for, because it's a scary world out there. We all know that, and here's what he wants us to know. So it begins with Jesus as being he's being always pressed in on by crowds. He's exhausted at this point. If you read the early chapters of Mark, every time he speaks, every time he heals, every time he performs miracles, crowds get bigger and bigger, and they press upon him. There's nowhere he can go for rest. There's nowhere he can go to hide. He can't get a break. They press in, and the more he does, the more they want. He does a miraculous something, and then they want more and more of it. In fact, so many of them want to keep him in that area so that they could claim him as king. He wants no part of what they understand a king to be. And he has to get away, but at this point, he's not had any rest. People have demanded more and more from him as they've seen what he's capable of doing. And every time he speaks, opens his mouth, a great crowd appears. And that's what sets into motion that he wants to get into a boat with his own disciples to cross over to the other side. He's exhausted. He's in the boat, which explains why he's asleep. Makes sense when you put things into context that he'd be so physically, emotionally drained, spiritually exhausted, that all he can do is find his way into a boat, invite them to go to the other side, and then he falls asleep quickly. So he takes this boat along with his own disciples across the Sea of Galilee, and these are seasoned fishermen, many of them are. They know that in an instant, little squalls and storms can appear from nowhere. If you've ever been there, you know it's almost in this sort of vacuum where it just funnels the wind and the storms, and it can happen so quickly before you're even aware that it comes upon you. It happens still to this day on the Sea of Galilee. They know that. But there's something about this storm that terrifies them. And you get a sense that even as seasoned as they were in terms of their familiarity with the water, they are clinging to life. One is trying to grab the rudder. The others are hanging on for dear life. They're trying everything they can to survive, and they know this one is really serious. And they sense the impending danger. And they begin to do everything they can just to survive. And I'm sure some of them, they're thinking about their wives and their children and what they're going to miss. And if they're no longer going to be in, they think to themselves, this might be it. And they are terrified. Now contrast that with what Carly just read. Jesus is asleep in the stern at the back of the boat. How in the world can anybody sleep through a storm? Some of you can, I know that, but in the midst of a storm on the Sea of Galilee, I mean, it's almost ludicrous, the contrast. People terrified, Jesus asleep. They wake him up and they ask, don't you care that we're about to lose our lives? And what does he say? Peace, be still. And everything begins to find itself in order. Waves and the wind diminish. And everything is restored back the way it was. And he turns to them and says, why are you so afraid? The early church loved this story. In fact, if you've seen some of the symbolism of the very early church, often the church is depicted as a small little boat heading into a storm. They loved this because it reminded them in a world that they were being persecuted by the Romans and they were being oppressed and people were walking away and family members were distancing themselves and the seeming of the world was at odds with them, and they were headed into a storm because that's the way their life felt like. It was just a storm, this chaos, and they couldn't overcome it. And they loved this story because it reminded them that no matter what storm they were entering in, Jesus would be with them. He's in the boat with them. He will be with them, and he'll calm the waters in the storm. Mark is a wartime gospel. If you haven't figured this out, just know that right after he writes this, all of Jerusalem is destroyed. A revolution by the Romans that come in to quell this revolution that's happening, and everything they ever thought they had in stability, the temple, everything is destroyed, meaning their whole life has fallen apart and feels like this perfect storm of terrible things that are happening. And so they gravitate more and more to this story because it's their story. And it's a story for all of us, I think, who live in fear. So a couple of things. One is, he tells them we're going to go to the other side. What does it mean? Don't just sort of read a phrase and think that's all it is on the surface. The other side is deep. It represents something. So when Jesus said, let's go, we're going to go to the other side, he's saying, I want you to go where most people will never go who are like us. We're going to venture into different kinds of places. We're going to meet and encounter different kind of people. And the other side represents in the Bible the things that you and I fear and the people we don't want to be with and the changes we don't want to happen. That's on the other side. We want to stay on this side where it's safe and predictable, comfortable. We don't want to put it ourselves out there because we don't know what's out there, but we suspect it's not going to be good for us. So 4 times in the gospel, Jesus goes back and forth to the other side, back to this side, and he does things that, if you're paying attention, is a message. He'll feed multitude of Jewish people on this side and then go to the other side and feed multitudes of Gentiles on the other side. And what he's trying to say is, trying to bridge these two together. The other side is not a scary side. That all your fears that you have of who they might be and what's going to happen, I want you to know they are people. And we also have a chance to feed them and to break down the dividing walls in us. I think there's this constant battle going on inside of us with Jesus. And Jesus is always, collectively and individually, trying to get us to go to the other side. And we resist it because there's something in our DNA that says we don't want to do that. We just want to stay where we are. We want to be comfortable. Jesus, don't do this. Let's just stay here. And this constant tug and push and this battle that happens, and Jesus saying, I want you to go to the other side, and we're saying we're going to do our dead level best. Jesus, why don't you just stay here with us because we like this. We don't know what that is. So he takes his disciples to the other side. And it's a moment, I think, when you realize there is another side, because I think sometimes we don't even realize that. So in a sense, what he's saying, there's always another side, whether you see it or not. I want to take you there because when you see it, I don't want you to miss what you might be able to comprehend. And if you don't go, you'll never see, you'll never experience, you'll never know what I want you to know, what I want you to see. And it's not easy to get to the other side. And what Jesus is always saying is, it's there waiting for you if you have the courage to go there. But if you don't go, you're going to miss something, and I don't want you to miss this. When I was a kid, they made us read this story. I don't know that they do it anymore, but some of you know this story. Remember Rip Van Winkle? I will tell you, I read the story of Rip Van Winkle. And I confess, I didn't get the story because I thought it was just about a man who fell asleep under a tree and slept for 20 years. What I discovered as an adult is that story is pretty meaningful because it's not about a man who sits under a tree, falls asleep for 20 years. It's a man who, as the American Revolution is beginning, sits down and falls asleep, and he misses it. He misses the entire American Revolution, the one thing that changed the trajectory of the entire world, and he's asleep because he missed it. That's the point of the story. And I think you and I sometimes, whether we know it or not, we just sort of sleepwalk through life, meaning we don't really want to see anything. We don't want to deal with whatever it is that's going to make us change or make us do things that we're not ready to do. And the idea is that we just sort of miss so much because we sleepwalk through life. Jesus will tell you there's something always on the other side. And I think it comes to a point in your life, you got to get pretty far to understand that. Jesus is always saying, whatever you think is the end, there's always something on the other side. Whatever you think the end of life is, there's something on the other side of death. There's something on the other side of the crisis. There's something on the other side of the marriage. There's something on the other side of an illness. And over again, you think it's going to bring you to a halt and a stop. And what he's saying is, no, you press through, push through, and you'll see on the other side things that if you had not pressed, pushed through, you would not have seen nor experienced. Growth is painful, change is painful, but there's nothing more painful than being stuck and staying where you are for the rest of your life because you're too afraid to go to the other side. The second part of this story is just read it also with the way in which the people who were hearing it for the first time would read it. So when you look at water, and there's a specific reason why this story takes place on the water, and particularly a storm on the water, is water holds everything in the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament. It's the waters of creation pushed back. It's the water of life in the middle of a desert. It's the water of sacrament to baptize. Water is incredibly important. But in a large body of water, everybody in that culture understood they were terrified of what is beneath the surface. Okay? It's like swimming in a lake and you feel something brush against your toes and you can't see it. You are terrified. In your wildest imagination, you think it's going to be something. And so they know whatever is down there is bad. And so in the Bible, it talks about Leviathan, the monster. And Revelation talks about the beast coming out of the sea. All the demons, all the things that are bad are really encapsulated underneath in the water. And so when Jesus calms the storm, he also says, I have dominion over the evil things that exist in this world. I have the power to set those things at peace and to still your hearts as well. Makes you wonder when he says peace, who he's talking to. Is he talking just to the wind? Is he talking to the waves? Or is he talking to the disciples? Meaning, I want you to be at peace. I want your hearts to be still. Don't be afraid. So in a sense, what it says is, this story is our story. It makes you wonder what he's trying to tell us, because I don't think it can be said often enough. God never, ever promises that nothing bad will ever happen to any of us. God never promises smooth sailing, no storms, no problems. Nobody actually in their right mind believes it. And if you believe it, go back and read the Bible again, because that's something Jesus never promises. In fact, he's very clear about it. You will have trials and tribulation in this world. By the fact of the matter that you follow me, it's going to lead you into places that are going to be difficult, challenging, hard, gut-wrenching, and it will require every single bit of it. He doesn't promise it's going to be smooth sailing, but what he promises is when the world comes crashing down, when the storms hit, when the chaos ensues, you're not going to be alone, and you'll have the presence of someone who will be with you in the midst of the worst moments of your life. Jesus doesn't create the storm, but he rises in the midst of them. Why are you so afraid? I don't know any of you who are parents. And every kid has it because they are afraid. What are they afraid of? The monster in the closet. Whatever's moving underneath their bed, and they scream out to the parent. They are terrified. No parent I know stands at the doorframe and says, look, there's a logical explanation for this, and you shouldn't be afraid, and if you're just rational, reasonable, you'll be fine, good night to you. No, you crawl in bed with them, and you hold them. And they start being less afraid of the monster they don't know and start feeling the love that gives them peace and strength and will help them go back to sleep once again. I want to show you an image before we leave. This is a painting, and it's by Rembrandt. So in 1633, Rembrandt paints this picture based on the story that we just read together. It's a famous painting. In fact, there's so much to it, and many of you who love art will know that you don't just look at a painting, you literally look at it for a long time, and you begin to see the details, and you begin to see the backside with the storms and the wind and the gale and this horrific storm that's threatening to capsize the boat, and the front end is literally almost dipping into the sea itself, and everybody on board seems to be terrified. You can also see the shades of light toward the back where Jesus is. That's Rembrandt's idea to say, even in the midst of the darkness storm, the light still begins to shine. And you can see one who's literally hanging over the edge with his hands. There's another character holding on to his hat. They are terrified. One is trying to grab the stern as best they can and the rudder, and there's Jesus. And you sort of look at this and you realize that's what he's trying to do, is to capture this story, paint it as best he can. And he captures all the fear and the terror, and the disciples are all there on the boat, and Jesus is all there, just like Mark says. And you begin to look, and all of a sudden you notice there's something odd about this painting. So there's Jesus. There's his 12 disciples. You can count them, 1, 2, all the way to 12. That's 13. But there's something different about this painting. There's 14 people in the boat, not 13. And there's one little figure toward the bottom, and nobody was really able to recognize him. It's Rembrandt. He paints himself into the picture, which is what Jesus is doing to invite us into this story, to put us on the boat, to remind us that in the worst storms of your life, he is with you, and you are not alone. Thanks be to God.